Hello everyone, welcome to UMD Media. This is our weekly the H panel or the Horn panel. We are back with the H panel. Please share, subscribe, like. We are live both on Facebook and YouTube. The H panel is a weekly program here at the UMD Media. UMD Media works on understanding, measuring, and doing, and it tries to contribute for a decision based on evidence, a discourse based on evidence, on all issues pertaining to the Horn of Africa. We are live on Facebook and YouTube. The H panel starts now. Okay, today, as usual, I have the pleasure of having back Faisal Roble, Zgel Gabisa, and Yusuf Garewat to the H panel. And our topic, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, is imagining post-Abiy Ahmed Ethiopia. What, who, when, and how. Gentlemen, again, welcome back to the H panel at UMD Media. It's a great pleasure to have you back, as usual. So we start off, as usual, with the Friday to Friday. What stood out for you? Let me start with Faisal. Faisal, what stood out for you since last Friday?
Thank you very much, Getachew, and welcome to my colleagues. I think this was a very, very detrimental and important week. I think what stood for me is the UN Ethiopian Commission's report on human rights and refugees and international law. I think as we discussed that, what we got from them is what we expressed and what we expected. I think the team and the panel was very eloquent on expecting a both sidism type report. What really stood up for me, even from that report, is the fact that they interviewed about 269 people, given the conflict and the size of damage and war. I thought that was not enough. And then when I looked at the report and found out that about 600,000 Tigrayans fled and went to Sudan from Makhydra, and that was not even addressed. That again is a huge weakness. And the third weakness was the report was shared by two parties, the very party that was a proponent in the war, and the side that really claimed to have been, wrong, i.e. Tigray side was not represented. As a matter of fact, if you look at the report, according to the UN, the Tigray side was represented by Abiy's team and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. So the killer was, and the criminal was here, also the judge in a way. The other thing that stood up quickly is the international pressure coming on Ethiopia and Abiy, from the US envoy to the European EU to the African to IGAD to AU. I cannot even list, but as many as 8, 9 actors are today in Addis Ababa, just making sure that Abiy listens to their plea, which is, can you do something about the war before it reaches Addis? And I think I will not extend my remarks on here because the post-Abiy politics is very interesting. So what we stood up for us is what is going to lead to the main topic, which is what and who and what would happen. And maybe I would reserve some of my comments for that, but it has been a very busy week and I'll leave it there.
Great.
If I may add one more, and I'm sure Scale and both I will come to that, is the quickly, hastily put together nine-front agreement that was declared today in Washington D.C. And that really is a key to our discussion today, because the what after the Abiy is probably hinges on what happened today. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. Maybe let's continue with the same question of what were the big ticket items for you, and Yosef, you may continue. You are muted, Yosef.
All right. I think there are too many to count, especially the. I mean, it's hard to keep track of the major points also. But to me, again, it seems to me that timing as a factor, is a very important phenomenon that I have seen again and again, and today also, in the past week also. You can easily see when I mean timing, it's either doing certain things on time or failing to do certain things on time. This has been the two main factors that run as a common denominator almost throughout all the events that have transpired in the past week. For example, let me go back to the enemies allied against Tigray, namely Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Amhara forces. They were very much aware of timing. They have been very much aware of timing. For example, when they left Western Tigray, when they left Tigray after being defeated, they left a ticking bomb inside Tigray. They were very much aware that they were leaving a ticking bomb, because they knew that it will need time for that bomb to explode, and that they have to work hard in order for that bomb to explode. That bomb to explode was the mass starvation. While they were within Tigray, within proper Tigray, they have destroyed almost most of the food sources, be it crops or livestock. They had displaced more than 2 million people, and they left time to do the rest of the job. That is the mass starvation. Even after they left Tigray proper, they kept their encirclement intact, with the hope that, let's say, within 4 or 5 months from now, the mass starvation will do its job. At minimum, it may kill hundreds of thousands, at maximum millions, and then Tigray will simply succumb. All that I am saying is that timing was, they were very much aware of the timing. The same is true with TDF. What we have seen with Kombelcha and Dessie victory was that TDF beat the allied forces against it in this marathon game. Because for TDF, it was not only winning, or it was not only defeating the enemy that was the main point, but winning the war on time. On time has to be underlined, because if TDF, for example, beats its enemy 6 months from now, it would be a Pyrrhic victory, because by that time it will have lost a sizable part of its population through mass starvation. So it has to beat the deadline, and that deadline has been set by the ticking time bomb. If it is to defuse that ticking time bomb, it will have to do it on time. So what we have seen in this past week is with the capture of Kombolcha and Dessie, and now they are almost at Kemise. It is that it has beaten them in this marathon race. Now, we also can explain this time phenomena by the world reaction. How did the world react to all of this? For example, The world, either through negligence or they didn't care enough, or because they prioritized Ethiopia's, unity and stability over the humanitarian crisis on Tigray, or because they simply kept misreading what was happening on the ground. I suspect it's a combination of all these factors. They have never gotten their timing right. A good example of that would be the sanctions imposed by the US. Now look at this. Had these sanctions happened 6 months ago, then it would have made sense, because it would have probably not only that one, but in addition, if they have done also, in addition, some other kinds of sanctions, probably it could have averted the disaster that have been facing the nation. But they did it almost when the allied forces of Tigray, OLA, and the rest of them are at the gates of Addis Ababa. Now, what does it mean sanctioning Ethiopia, for example, it has been expelled from AGOA? It's almost like sanctioning the transitional government, because given the time, when this will be implied, when will it take effect? It's as if, the time that these allied forces get into Addis Ababa, they will face the consequences of these sanctions. Why did this happen? Because the US have gotten its timing wrong. When we talk about misreading, let me say a few words on what Faisal has already mentioned. A good example of that misreading phenomena is with the joint report that has come out recently. If you have looked, the things that they have missed, I mean, when we talk about reading what's on the ground, let's talk about categorically big things. For example, Western Tigray has been where the biggest atrocity has been conducted. More than 1 million Tigrinya-speaking people have been evicted from that area through ethnic cleansing. Now, there is a difference when people are displaced through war. In Western Tigray, if you remember, the war it was a very brief one. It took place at the very beginning. It doesn't even take more than a week or 2 weeks at best. And it was not large scale, because there was only about 1 battalion or so of TDF. TDF soon withdrew from Tigray, and for almost the whole year, there hasn't been any war in Western Tigray. So that means that the more than 1 million Tigrayans that have been evicted from Tigray are not because of war casualties, but they were intentionally targeted by the Amhara forces, village by village, town by town, to leave the area and be pushed to the interior of Tigray. So that entire picture doesn't exist in the commission report, in the report of this joint commission. The other one is the massive destruction that has been going on inside Tigray. For example, the food sources, how they attacked the food sources of intentionally, especially on the Eritrean side. I remember there was an estimate at one time of how much livestock have been lost. It was considered to be 4.6 million. Out of this, there were about 2 million were from Western Tigray. They were either killed or stolen or looted. And of course, the factories, the businesses, the universities, the health centers that have been totally destroyed inside Tigray, with the intention of denying livelihoods as much as possible in the urban areas as well as in the rural areas. So all with the intention of the mass starvation, preparing the entire Tigrayan population for mass starvation in months ahead. And the last one was the intentional denial. I mean, the denial, and it was intentional, of all kinds of services by the government. It's not even hiding it nowadays, the denial is complete. All kinds of services have been denied to denied access to Tigray. All of that is missing in this report. That's why even the idea of the idea of genocide doesn't even come close to what they are saying. I think I'd better stop here. I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Yusuf. I was on the screen. There was the Human Rights Watch reaction to the joint report as well, calling upon concerned governments to establish and support an independent international investigative mechanism, because they found it to be substandard as well. Professor Eskel, you were actually the one who saw maybe the post Abiy Ahmed Ethiopia coming. You kind of suggested even early on, a week before at least, for the panel to handle that. So we'll be coming to that. But again, what can you add to what were the big items in the past week?
Of course, it was a events-packed week, so it's very hard to select what stands out. But since we're concerned about the Horn of Africa, what matters is what happens in Ethiopia, because discourses about what the Ethiopian government or the state would be, it was a matter of concern for most of us. We saw the possible implosion of the government early on, but it also became the talk of the town everywhere, that even governments around the world, or governments that care about the Horn of Africa for their own reasons, they saw what was coming and started really basically talking about the possible disintegration or dissolution of the state of Ethiopia. That is something that states usually avoid. They don't predict something like that. They don't want to remind people to start to lose a sense of authority in their own country, but that happened. All of this was precipitated, I think, by the fall of the two towns in the southern Wallo, Dese and Kombolcha. If I correctly remember, that happened on the 30th of October, a day after we talked about what might happen last week. But the fall of Kombolcha and Dese and Kombolcha, for one, it had interesting characteristics. I thought, just following the events there, that there would be urban fighting, there would be urban engagement, there would be some kind of bloodshed, that the Ethiopian army, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, heard reports that they had artilleries near churches and mosques. So the end of it would have, I thought, at least many people also thought, that it would be calamitous. It's not that Dese and then Kombolcha fell almost without not the predicted bloodshed. It fell, and it's as if nothing happened. Life continued in Dese and in Kombolcha. Of course, what happened to the mayor, appointing the mayor, is an issue, but life continued in both of these places. The apocalypse that was predicted didn't happen. Of course, there were casualties on both sides, but the predicted apocalypse did not happen. Life went on. That has significant implications for the rest of towns, because if what was predicted, the calamity, the catastrophe, the apocalypse didn't happen, it kind of eases tension for the next town to fall. So that was an indication of the turning point in this war. In this war that we kind of remembered the anniversary, the 1-year anniversary the other day. Another thing is why it is really a turning point is that this was predicted to be Ethiopia's counteroffensive, that they were going to roll back the Tigrayans into Tigray and even exterminate Tigrayan forces out from Tigray itself. Well, it didn't happen. That didn't happen. Not only that it didn't happen, that the Tigrayans engaged in counter-offensive, the Tigrayan Defense Forces in counter-offensive, in the speed with which that was proceeding, the speed with which they went from Wallo to Kombolcha and now down to almost northern Shawa, or northern Shawa, changed the conversation within Ethiopia and outside Ethiopia. The discourses about Ethiopia's offensive was quickly, with really rocket-like speed, changed to Addis Ababa is threatened. Another characteristics there one should talk about is that the TDF and OLA had a prior agreement, a military alliance against the incumbent regime in Addis Ababa, but that did not come into operation until this week. It is only this week that that dimension, the idea that the TDF and the OLA, which were separate activities, but both aimed at bringing down the Arat Kilo regime, now in Wallo met. Not only did they meet in Wallo, but they started this cooperation. So the agreement that they had earlier went into effect. And that is really what is really bringing this speed, because from there they might go down to Awash. There are some forces, the Tigrayan forces, that are within a striking distance to Mille. And here is the significant thing, that it was an anaconda strategy of strangulating Tigray and forcing them into submission. The Tigrayan Defense Forces, their commanders always said, and Getachew Reda always repeated, they said, our goal in this war is to break out of the siege. And last week, the siege was basically broken. The siege is broken. And because of that, not only the conversation in Ethiopia and outside Ethiopia changed, but it also touched off a flurry of activities. The American envoy was sent to the Horn of Africa. Reports say that he'd left Addis Ababa. The Ethiopian prime minister, I don't know exactly what ultimatum or proposal was taken to him, but I've heard that he had rejected the proposal that Jeffrey Feltman took to him. So this flurry of activities. But what is interesting about this flurry of diplomatic activities is no one knows the end game. They're all confused. I think the American foreign policy towards the Horn of Africa also failed this week. In the Sudan, it failed because of after the coup d'etat. In Ethiopia now, it is failing. So that is the kind of thing that the event in Wallo, in Dese and Kombolcha, really changed the whole panorama of events in that week. And it's going to be remembered that it was that week that actually change came to Ethiopia. So basically, it is the Wallo and Kombolcha and the consequences of the fall of the Wallo and Kombolcha that really changed international discourse about disintegration of Ethiopia, and of course the OLA dimension is what actually brought the forces that are opposing Abiy to the doorsteps of Addis Ababa, and the rest of the world. They really don't know what to do about it. They want to keep the Ethiopian government alive. No state wants to declare a state is dead and moribund. They don't want to do that. They fear for bloodshed, but their attention is engaged.
Thank you on that. So talking about the joint investigation, I think Getachew Reda talked to the BBC after the release. He said like this:
clear on our position to agree on an independent investigation for anything on any allegation that could be flung against us. We categorically reject the so-called finding of the UN Human Rights Commission, because it was done with an Ethiopian institution that was particularly interested in whitewashing the crimes of Abiy Ahmed. Otherwise, we are open for independent investigation.
Let me ask you about the
Okay, so with that, maybe yes, it has been full of events, a week that was busy everywhere from all dimensions. We might not cover everything, but the topic of what's next, what's post Abiy Ahmed Ethiopia. So the who, the what, the how, and the when, timing. Faisal, Yosef spoke about that. So maybe we can start with Yosef with his scale on the, because you are in Washington DC. I'm not sure if you were part of that, but let's talk about what happened today. And Faisal was alluded to that as well. So this is a report from Global News.
As a response to the myriad of crises facing the various nations of the country and to reverse the harmful effects of Abiy Ahmed's autocratic rule to our peoples and beyond, we have recognized the urgent need to collaborate and join our forces towards a safe transition in the country. Hence, have established the United Front of Ethiopian Federalist and Confederalist Forces.
So this is a signing ceremony today. The name of the front is Federalist and Confederalist. Professor Eskel?
Yeah, I am in Washington, but I did not attend the signing ceremony. I heard that the speaker actually was thanking the Ethiopian Federalist Forces for bringing them together, but even though I am a part of that, but I was not in it. I think what they're also rushed into signing this or announcing the alliance or the possible alliance, that the expansion of the alliance that was started by the TDF and OLA. But I think in time they will make some concrete agreement that we can look at and then see what will happen. But basically what it is showing that the change of government or the fall of government in Ethiopia is becoming imminent. It's a recognition that it is imminent, and they're trying to do what is possible to show what Ethiopia is going to look like in the next political dispensation. The idea that this is going to be a multinational federal arrangement, that it will return to the status quo ante, is probably not enough. And I think the reason that they added that the term confederation is recognition that the multinational federal arrangement that had been in place in Ethiopia since the adoption of the 1995 constitution is not functioning today and may not be enough to accommodate the grievances of the regions in the future. I think it would be a prejudgment to say that confederation is going to accommodate it. I think it is going to be the exercise of the right of self-determination that is going to determine what shape the Ethiopian state will have, if it is going to be there to stay together. There are questions about whether Ethiopia could continue as a state, but these are forces of self-determination. There are many more forces of self-determination that are not included in here, but events, I guess, overtook them and they rushed it into announcing it. Other than that, it's a good beginning. This is needed, an alliance of forces that are determined to end the fascistic government in Ethiopia, and I use that term advisedly because it's appropriate. It's not only that, but what this signals is that it is not an alliance against the Prosperity Party. Even though that is what it is, but that's not the whole thing. It is also an idea about what is going to be the relationship between the nations and nationalities in Ethiopia. Is it going to be federation or confederation? So that conversation had been joined today as a result of the announcement of representatives of the different nations and nationalities in Ethiopia. So what it is pointing out to, that the future of Ethiopia is yet to be, the future of the form of governance in Ethiopia is yet to be determined, but the first step was taken today.
Okay, great. Thank you so much on that. And what you mentioned earlier on is the rejection by Abiy Ahmed on the proposal from the US, all that. And he's doing that because he's still hoping he would fight that out. So this is a graphic video from Bale in Oromia. We don't see this kind of videos often because the whole airwaves are dominated by government propaganda. But these are mothers, sisters seeing off these forced, people. Abiy is forcing to take them, to the war front. So let's hear that. Faisal, again, the same question about the Washington, D.C. signing ceremony and a reaction on that. You may also react to what has been said by Hizkel and Yosef so far.
Thank you very much. I think much has been said about the military geniusness of TDF, if I may say so. I would say TPLF, TDF has been genius militarily, but according to my observation for the last 30 years, TPLF has never been genius when it comes to political engineering. I think their political engineering has always been inferior. I have been following that for the last 30 years. I was one of the early voices that spoke about the one-party dominant culture that EPRDF was creating as far back as 1996, when Samuel Huntington was commissioned by the USAID to advise the Ethiopian government to create what was at the time called a peasant-based power and ignore all democratic values. I think what I have seen this weekend in Washington, D.C. is a same playbook that dominant groups would like to create, if you will, forces that don't exist, because it said that nine fronts that oppose Abiy's government came into play and created this coalition of common front. I don't know about others, but I do know very well the Somali political landscape, and what they invited to the space is not a political force, nor is it a front. So I'm very, very much afraid that the 1991 culture of bringing the two big powers at the time in 1991, Paul Haynes was my teacher. They brought the two big powers at the time, Amara People's Democratic Front and TPLF, and Oromo Force was a junior, the third junior, and the fourth was the Southern Gurubis. And what we inherited from that political culture is something that has been a culture of terror and undemocratic in the last 30 years. I think what I've observed just from the procedural aspect, I think Pascal is right in the sense that things can be perfected. I think the content of federalism and confederation is all on the table, but the way you create faint and figmented forces and dress them in a way that they fit your agenda is a political chicanery, in my opinion. So what had happened this weekend could really have a long and huge impact on where we walk. I'm not afraid for Ola to take its share in the political stake, Neither am I afraid for TPLF, TDF to also take its share. What I'm seriously questioning is how the others would be treated, especially you have two big armed groups who are literally taking the Ethiopian government down, and then you have others that they haven't invited. So I would have liked it, and then probably I will stop there. I would have liked it if they gave, and I can understand what happened in Washington is nothing more than giving a cover to the military success that's happening in northern Ethiopia and near Addis Ababa. That's understandable. I think what this message, this conference and agreement was sending to the West is that not only are we doing a military campaign here, but we are also working on the political aspect, and that seems to be welcomed. But spending 1-2 more weeks answering to the different groups calling the information center that was created by this group to just postpone 1-2 weeks to get who is who and who is coming from the so-called, if you will, in the past we used to call the appendix agar groups, and giving them more space to create their own leaders, to send their own delegates to this bid would have been, it took Somalis a surprise as to what happened, and I would like that to be corrected in the very, very immediate future if this thing wants to be succeeded. I think another thing that we need to pay to attention is it's one thing to win the military, it's another thing to win the political. The communique that was written and read over there literally emphasized what has happened in the last 3 years since 2018. That is on the opposite side, what PP has been telling the public that the last 3 years were excellent and good. The past 27 years were the hell. My own president, Mustafa Umar, is known for wiping out everything that Ethiopia has done in the last 150 years, but concentrating on the 27 years that EPRDF/TPLF run the country. And I think I saw the opposite of that in this. The communique talked about basically how the last 3 years have been bad, and I think that's another shortcoming. I'm paying a lot of attention to what happens in Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa or Finfinne is a contested political space. Oromos have a very legitimate historical issue when it comes to Addis Ababa and its surrounding. The other side, particularly the Amara group, are also putting their stake on Addis Ababa. That would require a very serious, beyond military power in order to be a successful mission to pacify, if you will, and capture Addis Ababa in a way. And lastly, I think, Getachew, you touched the issue of Getachew Reda welcoming post-transition kind of free investigation of what had happened. I would like to throw a new idea. I think we don't need that. We need a restorative justice type approach to what had happened in the last 30 years. Pains have shifted. In the East, in the Somali region, the most painful history, including blockade, rape of women during the peak of aid, took place during the EPRDF 2007-2014. With the Tigray region, they have seen what I could call a semi-genocide, because that's a legal term to be, but a huge, atrocious, what could be to explain by some as a genocide, took place in Tigray. We cannot address one piece of history and neglected the other. So in order to really build a successful project beyond Abiy, we should go back and establish a restorative justice that looks at everything that went wrong in the last 30 years. Ethiopia has been hellhole in the last 30 years. So this morning's communique to just look at the last 3 years is not satisfactory to me. Neither is it satisfactory to the Somalis, who have really seen the bulk of the massacre and atrocities in the last 30 years.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Faisal. On that, we'll try from the media to bring the people who organize this and maybe, have this, they are saying specifically in terms of charting the future, the next weeks and so on. One thing they mentioned is that this is not a government who would be replacing Abiy. This is parties coming together, and I hope, to your point, they would expand on what Ismail was saying as well, in bringing more really, parties with real social base. Maybe not, one person or a group of people and so on. Yosef?
Getachew, if I may, just if you don't mind, and I and Scale spoke in detail about many issues on the Horn and particularly the region. I think what had happened yesterday and today at the ceremony pitted Somali groups one against another. As you know, Somalis have different socio-cultural system, and people are addressing it today because of the attitude and identity of the person is handpicked as a replacement of the other enemy side of where Mustafa comes. What we have been crying, and a lot of Somalis sent their pleas, was to give the Somalis a chance to go back to the books and then see if they can participate in this project in a way that fits the broad-based Somali fund. So I understand the cover-up, the quick thing, and we can talk about this as this thing develops, but I'm in no way opposing it. I'm just trying to perfect and highlight the best process I can find for this. Thank you.
That's, I think, a great contribution of the panel, right? Hope they take that into account. Yosef, I know you have more regional perspective, the forces, all that, but with that lens, how do you see post Abiy Ahmed Ethiopia playing out? You are muted, Yosef. Let me unmute you.
All right, okay. Well, there is one thing that I saw. It's easy to, well, it's not easy exactly, but it's easier to see the trajectory, the military trajectory, once, especially once you have a hindsight, 4 months or 6 months along that trajectory. But it's not that easy when it comes to the political goal, at least for me. Probably, Hizkiel and Faisal being more, knowledgeable about the ins and outs of Ethiopia. They could say more about this. But for me, the problem that I have is, for example, from the very beginning, when those 9 factions met at Washington, D.C., they had this general description of being federalists and co-federalists. That by itself shows you that, of course, that the centralists are not there, which is fine, but probably the dividing line will be somehow in between the federalists and the co-federalists. Not necessarily antagonistic, but also not necessarily complementing one another. So to me, the biggest issue that came with that is the idea of federalism. Probably part of the reason why Faisal keeps on reminding us that we should look further than the 3 years is, to me, the very idea of federalism itself. I don't mean that I am against federalism. I am, in fact, for federalism, at least, in the previous one. But here is my question. Was there ever, could there be federalism without democracy? Has there ever been a nation on this earth, on the face of this earth, that had federalism without democracy? I have been looking at today through the Google, at all the nations that have the federal system, that have adopted the federal system, and I couldn't find a single one. Probably Russia comes close, but Russia also had much more democratic institutions than Ethiopia had ever had. So we have this. So during EPRDF, we have this centralized, centralized state that yet professes to have a federal system. Now there is this contradiction in between the two. Now, I don't mean there are not federal elements or federal characteristics that didn't exist then. The very idea, for example, that that the killings are created along ethnic and linguistic lines is also a federal characteristic. the very fact that people began to use their own language in education, in administration, in journalism, in literature, in whatsoever, that too is also an advancement towards federalism. The very fact that to some extent they use their own resources in their own killel is another thing. But the very idea, for example, of seeing your own kind of face, your own ethnic leadership from your own ethnic group is also an advancement. But even with all those included, without democracy, there cannot be any kind of federalism at the in the nation. Let me give you, for example, one example. One of the things that constantly came as a problem within the federal system inside Ethiopia, that was the idea of the balancing act between collective rights and the individual or even minority rights within that klil itself. That has been a problem many times. So we have seen it. I mean, the killings and the purges that have been going on from one klil to another. Another thing is the many, for example, one of the things that Faisal mentioned was about, for example, this game that is being played one clan against the other. For example, right now, even within the prosperity part, we could see that the ones that have been elected in Afar and in Somalia, the trick is to have to choose one leader from one clan, and he brings his whole clan into that administration. And thereby, you have what? You have a mini dictator imitating the dictator at the top, all under the name of a federal system. So my biggest problem with the APRDF federalism is that it was an impossible task. If you don't have full-blown democracy within that nation, you cannot have federalism. That was my first one. The second part is the structural part. I'm talking about all of this because it's time to examine. If they are talking about creating a federal arrangement inside Ethiopia now, correcting it, people are talking about correcting that federal arrangement in Ethiopia. I think it should start by looking at it very closely. The other part of the problem in the federal system of Ethiopia, to me, was that there were two killers in particular, that's Amhara and Oromia, which are too big for the nation. They make up, population-wise, these two killers make up almost 2/3 of the entire population. We are talking about the rest of minorities making up only 1/3 of the entire population. Other nations have solved this kind of problem in federalism. For example, in India is a good example. In India, the Hindi-speaking people, as a mother tongue, the Hindi-speaking people make up almost 40% of the population, more or less similar to what the Oromos, probably a little bit less, 35%, that kind of a population. But the Indian government or the Indian fathers, I don't know, they foresaw the problem of this. India is supposed to have admirably solved its language problem in many ways. It does have other problems, the religious problem, Hindu versus Islam, and the caste problem. But the language problem has other nations have been emulating India's formula in this case. Now, what India did was it created 8 provinces out of the Hindi-speaking region, all of them Hindi-speaking though, and then two other also languages which were considered too big were divided, one into 3, the other one into 2. The rest of them, all in all, there are about 22 of them provinces. The rest of them was basically one language dominates the other regions. So this idea, the idea of having these two big entities, it's almost like having one of them could be a kingmaker. For example, at this point in time, the Amhara region has become a kingmaker of Abiy. Without his support, it will disintegrate. But have we had, for example, 5 regions in Amhara, this kind of unanimity would have been impossible to attain. So that was one of the problems. The other one is, besides what is happening in in India, like having one klil, too bulky for a nation to hold. The other one is what Ali Mazrui of Kenya and Nyerere have pointed before. What they said was, they were talking in regard to Rwanda and Burundi. And what they were saying was, they were kind of troubled by the fact that these two tribes, the Tutsi and the Hutu tribes, were always at each other's throat. They were always having this constant genocides of one another that never stopped. And what Ali Mazrui asked Nyerere was, how can we solve this question? And Nyerere is supposed to have said, I'm not quoting him exactly, but more or less the words that he said was, for a nation, 2 is a terrible number to be. For one nation, 2 big entities facing each other is a terrible number to be. So in Ethiopia, even though nowadays the confrontation is between Tigray and Amhara, the confrontation between Amhara and also Oromia, these 2 big entities confronting one another would also be a problem for a federal state to function. So to me, if they are talking about this amalgamation, if there is this idea of how the federal system is to work inside Ethiopia, then these questions should be seriously raised. This is part of my assessment.
Great, thank you, Yosef. Professor Rizgal, you might reflect on what has been said by both panelists, but I want you to also reflect on what the UN Security Council said in the statement today, which was new compared to what was happening from the Security Council over the past year. So this is a statement concerning what the Russia, China, India, and the rest of the Security Council have agreed today.
And unhindered humanitarian access, the re-establishment of public services, and further urge the scaling up of humanitarian assistance. They further call to put an end to hostilities and to negotiate a lasting ceasefire and for the creation of conditions for the start of an inclusive Ethiopian national dialogue to resolve the crisis and create the foundation for peace and stability throughout the country. The members of the Security Council reiterated their support for the role of regional organizations.
So this was something that was missing, at least from some of the countries that were really echoing what Abiy Ahmed was saying, just copy paste. So you can reflect on that and on what was said so far, Professor Rizgal.
All right. On the issue of the United Front, and that's what it is. This is a united front of parties. They came together to form a united front to end the war in Ethiopia and to bring change of government or regime change in Ethiopia. They haven't started contemplating what kind of a governing structure would be imposed in Ethiopia. And that's not, in fact, why they came together. It's expressly to come together to try to end the Abiy totalitarian regime. So whether that is going to be federalist or confederalist, it is premature. Even for us to talk about it is premature because we haven't gotten there. And we're not going to begin prescribing this is better for Ethiopia and this is unacceptable for Ethiopia. It's not at that stage. So all I want to say about with regard to what Ethiopia is going to look like in post-Abiy or post-prosperity, with regard to possibilities of association, a kind of association between nations and nationalities, is that the mistake that was made in 1991 was not about the size. The mistake that was made at the time was that the federation was a holding together federation. It was made a holding together federation to keep an empire together from falling apart. That was the problem of conception of the problem. At that time, when the federation was put together, it was to make sure that Ethiopia didn't disintegrate. It was a holding together federalism. Without any prejudice to the form of federalism that Ethiopia might adopt in the future, what one could say at this point in time is that because the holding together federalism was a mistake, it was imposed from top to down. The reverse should be the option that should be available for consideration for Ethiopia's nations and nationalities. It has to be a coming together federalism. A federalism it's a federation of the willing nations and nationalities. It is the nations and the nationalities that will probably form an association in the future. Those are principles. The principles are that we are not going to repeat the mistakes of 1991. We have to learn from them. So if this forum, as it will be perfected and then expanded, the consideration should be, it shouldn't be top down, and it shouldn't be holding to save an empire that was built on the basis of brutality and blood. But the free choice of the nations and nationalities should be the principle that should govern any federalism or confederalism or any other form of association between the nations and nationalities. And that's what I wanted to say on the first one. I think the group that formed the alliance this time, the United Front, a United Front of, by the way, it's not the TPLF that brought them together. It is all of them coming together to form a United Front. But they must take into account what Faisal expressed. Understand, don't repeat 1991. Try to avoid 1991. All the mistakes that were done in 1991 should be expressly avoided in any association that they're forming now. Second, they don't have to be rushed by events into forming an alliance, which is in some ways half-baked. And thirdly, don't be pushed into forming an alliance by people who have no accountability to anything, except that they want to be seen in there. So all of these events and unaccountable individuals should not rush them into making this kind of front. That said, Faisal is right that this is an important step with all its imperfections. Perfecting it is important, but then listen to voices like Faisal when it comes to, for instance, the Somali region. No one can understand better the Somali politics and Somali history and the brutality that they had suffered under the Derg and under the EPRDF. No one knows that better than the Somalis themselves. They need to be listened to. They haven't been listened to this time. That's important. On the third one, on the Security Council, I think my take on that is about the end of hostilities is a one way to end this hostility, this war, this brutal war. The brutal war that showed the world the worst of humanity, the worst and the wretchedness of human beings. That's what we saw in Ethiopia. In this case, for the United Nations or for the United States or for the European Union, this both sidism that I talked about the other day, or trying to not speak ill of another government, when people are actually dying, starving to death, when that is happening, to simply continue to think in geopolitical terms or in political terms alone, when people are dying, that is not the responsibility of the United Nations. The responsibility of the United Nations is to avoid war and stand with people who are brutalized. When genocide is happening, to come up with a human rights report in which say both sides did something. And I've spoken about how actually this document was produced 2 weeks ago. To say that the people who are fighting for their survival, fighting against genocide that had already been committed and is in the works to commit more, to say both sides are responsible, both sides have done this and that. That's not what the United Nations was established for. The United Nations were established after the Holocaust. Never again was their motto. So blaming both sides, the perpetrator of genocide and the one at the receiving end of genocide, that's not the mission of the United States. That's not what the United Nations stands for. And that's not even what the United States, as an actor, as a big actor in world politics, is advancing. US policy, as I said, in the Horn of Africa is already a failure. You do not continue to do the same thing that had led to your failure. The United States policy success is dependent on the values that they are promoting. The same could be said for the EU. But this moral equivalency, where the perpetrators of genocide and the ones that are advancing hate speech as we hear it today, to be put on the same pedestal and be compared and say blame of both sides, is an abomination. It's really an abomination. But maybe one or two things could happen in Ethiopia. Either the opponents win the war and then they determine what the future would be. Or in 3 phases, and I don't want to get into that so that I can give time to my colleagues. In 3 phases, they go from preconditions for negotiations to maybe negotiated settlement, and then to a political transition. This should not be mixed up. So basically, there are phased. One scenario one is a phased unfolding of end of war, end of hostilities to political settlement. But negotiations for the future of Ethiopia and negotiations to end war should not be mixed up. But all I want to say is that for the international organization and for the big powers, the moral equivalency should be stopped.
Great, thank you so much on that. So we are over the hour, but we cannot close it without getting your final words. So you can also react to what has been said, so that this is, the people who are following us both on YouTube and Facebook get your full insight. And we'll be coming back next week again with more developments. So final words, Yosef, Faisal, and Eskel. Yosef, you are muted.
I know. All right. Okay. We are talking about post-Abiy politics. I understand that. But either, the faults that both of the panelists have mentioned before will be repeated again if we have the kind of federalism that have been there. And it will be a failure, it means, or at least, when a group of federalists are going to meet anywhere, you would assume that they would know what federalism means or how federalism would work in their own country. So the idea is either it will succeed or it will fail. But if federalism is going to succeed, then we will have to talk about it. I mean, every one of us, including those people who are in the meeting, or it will repeat again with different actors. Anyway, to talk about the coming week or a few weeks from now, it seems that the fall of Abiy is imminent, be it in days or weeks. It also seems that my only fear about the UN is that although it seems quite late, the only thing that's left for the Abiy government is to call for the UN forces to come in between his forces and the TDF forces. If he can pull off that miracle, then we could see a surprise. But I doubt this thing will happen. Even though, if it comes to the UN, I don't see how Russia and China would oppose it, given that it would come from Ethiopia itself, and the rest will go along with it. But as I said, it's too late for that. The other one is the thing that we haven't talked up to now is the Eritrean factor. What will Eritrea do? Because it's quite frozen right now. It doesn't seem like the metaphorical and the legendary Buridan's ass, who cannot decide between two equal food that was put in between his left and right, and thereby died of starvation. The Eritrean government doesn't seem to decide what to do, torn in between its demographic problem and the wish that its desire to bring an end to Tigray's hegemony in that area. Now, what will Eritrea do is probably one of the questions that needs to be asked. Although I believe that it will do the same thing that it has been doing now. Probably it will come out of Western Tigray. If it sees that the fall of Abiy is imminent, thereby making the Sudanese border accessible to the TDF. Another thing, though, it will dig trenches and wait for the imminent assault from possibly from Tigray. With that note, I hope I will end my analysis. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Yusuf. Faisal, you are muted, Faisal. You are still. We can't hear you. You are still, I think, having issues. So until you fix that, maybe Professor Eskel, your final words.
For next week, we should wait for what the outside world is going to do about Ethiopia. The proposal that was taken to the Prime Minister has been rejected. And the scene of activity has moved from Addis to a neighboring country. If they are still thinking in prism terms. That is to say, they have a certain prism through which they see Ethiopia or the international state system. They're not going to resolve Ethiopia's problems. They have to see them with fresh eyes and be creative in resolving the issue. One way or the other, this war is going to end. It will either end by the triumph of the opponents or maybe the government, even though that's not in the cards right now, or a negotiated ceasefire leading to a transitional government. That requires thinking, drilling down, and coming up with creative solutions for Ethiopia. Otherwise, it would be a bad precedent for all of Africa that people could perpetrate genocide against their own people, hiring mercenaries and clandestinely bringing forces from other places. The Horn of Africa right now is going to be a tinderbox of conflict and bloodshed. It requires a creative solution, not simply a preservation of regimes and the international state system. And that's what we should expect next year, that they probably become more creative like they did with the Dayton Peace Accords as Yugoslavia was unraveling some 3 decades ago.
Okay, thank you, Professor Asgal. Maybe Faisal, you might try now. We're still having issues, so maybe you can try without that.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay. So, thank you very much. And I think at times we need to really, and I'm not saying the three of us, but our learned people need to be and have the foresight. I remember when Isaias visited Addis Ababa in 2018, I was in Addis and I was by the Polo airport, and the night they went to Awasa, the mood that was expressed there kind of made me worry. So I jotted down an article at the time where I was saying, prior to the Holocaust in Germany, there were talks that preceded, and it was only the people from the Jewish community that could see what was coming up. But their friends from the German community who were, doctors and musicians were saying, no, impossible, this will not happen in Germany. We don't see what you guys see. What happened after that, history has it. And I think we missed, when Abiy came to power, we missed what he was saying and how he was beating the drum for Pax Ethiopiana, which the society in that imperial structure have been fighting for a long time. Somehow we missed. I think learning lessons from there, we don't have to again miss what's happening. I think we should not miss or even romanticize, and I think Eskiel expressed very well, the role of the UN. The role of the UN most of the time is not to address issues that are critical to the people who are at the bottom. The UN serves the nations who are member states. At this panel, in this media, Getachew several times, especially when we started, we even talked about why the UN cannot create a safe corridor or an airdrop for Tigray so that 1 million plus people who are starving could be fed. There was the capacity, but there was not the willingness, because the UN is never known to help people. They usually speak in the mouth of member states. The same we said this afternoon about the Commission's report, which really did not address not only Tigray, but also very low scale but vicious war is happening against the people of Oromia, and even in some instances, Sidama and Benishangul. So the selection of the Tigray crisis, although requires attention, but here it tells you that the UN always short changes and goes to the quick, path to get, I think those issues would be something that we will address in the immediate future. I agree with both that Abiy's fall is imminent. I think I very much argued for the last 1 month that the Kombolcha captured by TDF and the Ola from the south will make that vortex where the two powers meet, and that changed everything. With Addis Ababa, I think I'm not privy of how the two forces will move into getting to Addis, but my sense is that there would be a pre-capture effort to pacify Addis Ababa so that Ola with its arms and TDF on the background may not move in this tinderbox of population of 5 million, 2 million of which could be against and 3 million in favor. I don't know, I'm just throwing that statistics, but what I'm saying here is that there are people in Addis who are not buying the victory of Ola and TDF. I think I have less to add to what has been said about the future path to craft a new government. I don't believe both Ola and TDF at this particular juncture are ready to see an unplanned, chaotic dismemberment of Ethiopia. And, I think that would be irresponsible. And they say that what is not irresponsible is to put on the table after the war the options that people have, whether it is self-determination to the fullest for some communities, or confederation, or a very democratic, as Joseph underlined, a very democratic federal system with a very loose and thin ability in the hands of the federal government. I don't think the 1991 is repeatable. My last comment is to just add one more wrinkle to the united front. It's not really a united front. It's as Kyle put it, it is people who came together probably with a big hand of two groups, Ola and TDF, not TDF, actually TPLF, from what I understand. I think when Addis Ababa is captured, and hopefully that would be anytime soon, I think we have to start afresh and see how we can bring people who represent different nations and nationalities at the ground, whether we collect those people from intellectuals, from armed groups. Some communities may not even have armed groups. That's why the concept of front is a little bit loose. I think we have to call known quantities and names such as ONLF in the Somali region, or the massive intellectuals who have been evicted from their region because of the current government from whom they run. So I see the bright side that Skayal expressed about what had transpired in Washington, D.C. I am full of caution, and I would underline my caution as we close this panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Faisal, for that input. And yes, when we met last week, we didn't saw this coming, this fast. We are at the stage where the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa actually advised the U.S. citizens in Ethiopia to leave the country as soon as possible. So this came out today. So who knows what would come when we meet next week. But for your time today and for your insightful input, thank you very much, gentlemen. And I'll see you next week. That was the H panel for today. The H panel, imagining post Abiy Ahmed Ethiopia, what, who, when, and how. We didn't go into the details. We just scratched the surface. We'll see you next week on the H panel. The H panel is over for today. ከመሰናበታችን በፊት የፕሮግራም ማስታወቂያ አለ። የፕሮግራም ማስታወቂያው ሰኞ ላለፉት 3-4 ሳምንታት ጉዳይ ሆነ የነበረው የአጋዚያን ትምህርት ቤት አጋዚያን በ1960 በአዲስ አበባ የተቋቋመ ትምህርት ቤት ነው። አጋዚያን ቁጥር 1፣ 2፣ 3 እያለ የሚሄድ ነበረ። ከዛ የደርግ መንግስት በመጣ ጊዜ የሚወረሱት ተወርሰው ስሙ ግን ተጠብቆ የቀጠለ ነበረ። አሁን በአዲስ አበባ አሁን የአብይ አህመድ መንግስት ከምርጫው በኋላ እንደገና የቃለ መሐላ ስነ ስርዓት ከተፈጸመ በኋላ አጋዚያን ትምህርት ቤት ይባለው የነበረውን አዲስ ምዕራፍ ትምህርት ቤት ተብሏልና በዛ ጉዳይ ላይ ብዙ የዛ ትምህርት ቤት ተማሪዎች የነበሩ የቀድሞ ተማሪዎች በተለያየ ሁኔታ ሐሳባቸውን እየገለጹ ይገኛሉ። ከነዛ መካከል ካሁን በፊት የሚዲያ ላይ ቀርቦ የነበረው ናቲ ብርሃነ ይፍሩ ሰኞ 7 PM ኢስተርን ታይም ስሜን መልሱልኝ ስሜን አጋዚያን ነው የሚለውን ዘመቻ በተመለከተ አጋዚያን ትምህርት ቤት እንዴት መቼ ተቋቋመ ምን ነበር እና አሁንስ የስም ለውጡን መቃወም አንድምታና ምልከታዎች ያጋራናል። ናቲ ብርሃነ ይፍሩ ከኔ ጋር የኤምዲ ሚዲያ ላይ ሰኞ 7 PM ኢስተርን ታይም ኒውዮርክ ዋሽንግተን ኢስት ኮስት ታይም እንገናኛለን። የዛሬውን ይህን ይመስል ነበረ። በኤች ፓናል ደግሞ አርብ ተመልሰን እንገናኛለን። መልካም ጊዜ